The Japanese fleet had found the Americans. On the morning of the 19th of June, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Taifei, watching the opening move of what Japan believed would be the battle that decided the fate of the empire. Far across the Philippine Sea, American ships were waiting near the island of Saipan. Ozawa believed he had everything he needed. He had the first strike. He had longer-range aircraft. He had the advantage of surprise. His plan was simple: attack from beyond the reach of American fighters, destroy the enemy carriers before they could respond, and use the airfields on Guam and Tinian to extend the range of his aircraft. Japanese pilots would strike, land, refuel, attack again, and return to their carriers. It was elegant, it was logical, and almost everything about the plan was correct. Except for one thing. The pilots who had to execute it were no longer the pilots Japan had possessed 2 years earlier. By the end of the day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would disappear into the sky over the Philippine Sea. The American fleet would barely be touched, and the Japanese Navy would lose something it could never replace: its future. The battle was called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Americans would later remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But behind that famous nickname was a far darker story. It was not simply a story about aircraft being shot down. It was the story of two nations fighting with completely different weapons. One had built a machine. The other was trying to survive with memories of one. The reason this battle mattered began 4 days earlier, on the 15th of June, when American forces landed on Saipan for Japan. Saipan was not just another island. It was the wall protecting the homeland. From the Mariana Islands, American B-29 bombers would eventually be able to reach the Japanese home islands. Tokyo, factories, military bases, and cities would suddenly become targets. The war that Japan had tried to keep thousands of miles away was coming directly toward its people. Japanese leaders understood the danger. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, sent a message to his forces telling them that the empire's survival depended on this battle. This was not exaggeration. Japan had spent years preparing for a decisive confrontation with the American fleet. The strategy had always been the same: bleed the Americans, destroy enough ships, force them to abandon their advance across the Pacific. Now the moment had arrived. But Japan was no longer fighting the same enemy it had attacked in 1941. The United States that entered the war after Pearl Harbor was not the United States that arrived at Saipan. 3 years earlier, Japan had possessed one of the most skilled naval air forces in the world. Its pilots had trained for years. Many had hundreds, even thousands, of hours of flight experience. They had attacked Pearl Harbor. They had dominated the early Pacific campaigns. They were experts. But wars consume experts faster than nations can replace them. The battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomon Islands slowly destroyed Japan's first generation of naval aviators. And Japan had made a devastating choice. It kept sending experienced pilots into combat, again and again, until they did not come back. Their knowledge disappeared with them. The United States made the opposite choice. American veterans returned home to train new pilots. Experience was transferred, mistakes became lessons. The system became stronger every month. By 1944, Japan was trying to rebuild an elite force that had already vanished. And Ozawa knew it. He understood the weakness of his air groups. That was why his plan depended so heavily on distance and surprise. If Japanese pilots could attack before American fighters reached them, their lack of experience might not matter. The plan depended on one question: could Japan strike before America could react? At first, it seemed possible. Ozawa's fleet was powerful. 9 carriers moved across the Philippine Sea, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Among them was Faye, Japan's newest carrier. She represented Japan's attempt to learn from past disasters. After losing carriers at Midway, Japanese designers created Faye with an armored flight deck, designed to absorb punishment. She was built to survive. Ozawa's fleet also carried a theoretical advantage, range. Japanese aircraft such as the Zero Fighter and various strike aircraft were designed for distance. They sacrificed protection for performance. They carried little armor. They lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. This made them fragile, but it gave them reach. A Japanese aircraft could strike from farther away than many American aircraft could. Ozawa built his entire strategy around that advantage. He would stay outside American striking range. He would attack first. He would force the Americans to fight a battle on his terms. There was only one problem. The Americans already knew he was coming. For days before the battle, American submarines watched. They tracked ships leaving their bases. They reported speed, direction, and composition. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, did not know Ozawa's exact position, but he knew something important. The Japanese fleet was approaching. That information changed everything. Ozawa believed victory depended on finding the Americans first, but the Americans had already been watching him. The Japanese won the scouting contest on the morning of the battle. Their aircraft located the American fleet first, but that advantage had already been lost before the first aircraft launched. Because the Americans had something more valuable than a single discovery. They had a complete picture, and waiting for Ozawa was the most advanced naval air defense system ever created. It began with radar. American ships could detect incoming aircraft long before human eyes could see them. A Japanese attack formation approaching from the horizon was no longer a surprise. It was a warning. The radar operators saw them coming. The fighter direction officers calculated their speed, altitude, and direction. Then they guided American fighters into position. For the first time in naval warfare, defending a fleet was becoming a mathematical problem. The Americans were not waiting to react, they were preparing. Above the carriers, pilots climbed into their F-6F Hellcats. The aircraft itself represented the difference between the two nations. The Japanese Zero had been designed around speed and maneuverability. The Hellcat had been designed around survival. It was faster. It was stronger. It carried heavier weapons. Most importantly, it protected the man inside armor plating. Self-sealing fuel tanks. A structure designed to absorb damage and bring pilots home. The Japanese aircraft could turn tightly, but the Americans had learned something important. A fighter that survives can fight again. A pilot who survives can train another pilot. Every American aircraft represented a system. Every Japanese aircraft represented a shrinking resource. The difference was not just technology, it was philosophy. Japan had built a perfect weapon for the beginning of the war. America had built an entire process for winning the war. That difference would become clear within hours. Approximately 10 a.m., Japanese aircraft appeared on American radar. The first wave was coming. Inside the Japanese formations, young pilots prepared for the attack. Many had never faced combat like this. They had courage. They had determination. But courage could not replace experience. They were flying toward an enemy that could see them before they could see the enemy. American Hellcats launched from carrier decks and climbed into position. The Japanese pilots delayed. They formed up. They followed procedure. But every second gave the Americans more time. The Japanese had expected to surprise the Americans. Instead, they flew directly into a trap. The sky above the Philippine Sea was about to become a killing field. And thousands of men on both sides were about to discover that modern war was no longer decided by a single heroic attack. It was decided by preparation, by training, by systems, and by the choices made long before anyone pulled a trigger. The first Japanese wave never reached the American carriers. That was the moment everything changed. The Japanese pilots had taken off believing they were attacking an enemy fleet that was vulnerable and unprepared. Instead, they found themselves entering a battlefield where the Americans knew they were coming. Radar operators watched the approaching formations. Fighter direction officers calmly calculated their movements. American Hellcats climbed into position above them, waiting with the advantage of altitude, speed, and surprise. The Japanese had expected to hunt. Now they were being hunted. When the American fighters finally attacked, they came from above and behind. The position every fighter pilot wanted. The position that gave the defender the advantage. Japanese aircraft scattered across the sky. Some pilots never understood what was happening until it was too late. They were not defeated because they lacked bravery. They were defeated because they were fighting a battle their training had never prepared them for. The first wave was destroyed. The second wave came, and it suffered the same fate again. And again, Japanese aircraft crossed the Philippine Sea and disappeared into a wall of American fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Americans were not simply defending ships. They had created a system designed to destroy an attack before it arrived. A Japanese pilot had to survive radar detection, then survive interception by Hellcats, then survive the guns of dozens of ships. Only after all of that could he attempt to hit a carrier moving through the ocean at high speed. It was an almost impossible task, and the men attempting it were often young pilots with limited experience. This was the tragedy at the center of the battle. The Japanese Navy still possessed excellent aircraft. It still possessed experienced commanders. It still possessed ships built for victory. But it no longer possessed the human foundation required to use them. The war had consumed the people who knew how to win. The Americans, meanwhile, had created a machine that became stronger every time it fought. Every lesson from earlier battles had been absorbed. Every mistake had been corrected. Every survivor had become a teacher. The difference between the two navies was no longer measured by individual skill. It was measured by time. And America had more of it, while the skies above the Philippine Sea became a disaster for Japan. Another battle was unfolding beneath the waves. The Japanese flagship Taifei had barely launched its aircraft when disaster arrived. The American submarine USS Albacore found the carrier and fired a spread of torpedoes. Most missed, but one struck. At first, the damage appeared manageable. Taifei was not supposed to die from one torpedo. She was Japan's newest and strongest carrier. Her armored flight deck had been designed to survive exactly this kind of attack. But the damage below the surface created another problem. Aviation fuel began leaking. The fumes spread through the ship. Then a decision was made that would prove fatal. The ventilation system was opened. Instead of removing the danger, it pushed the explosive vapor throughout the carrier. Hours passed. The crew continued fighting. Aircraft continued operating. The ship continued moving. But inside Taifei, a hidden enemy was growing. Then, suddenly, the carrier exploded. The ship that Japan had built to survive the lessons of Midway was destroyed not by a devastating air attack, but by a chain of human mistakes. More than 1,000 sailors died. Ozawa survived, but his flagship was gone. The commander who had planned the battle now watched it unfold from another ship. His carefully designed operation was already collapsing, and the Americans were not finished. Another Japanese carrier, Sheikaku, suffered a similar fate. The submarine USS Kavala found the veteran carrier and launched an attack. Sheikaku had been one of Japan's proudest ships. She had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. She had survived some of the earliest battles of the Pacific War. But now she was struck by torpedoes. Fires spread through her hangar deck. Aircraft fuel and ammunition transformed the carrier into a floating explosion. After hours of burning, Shikoku disappeared beneath the sea. 2 of Japan's carriers were gone. Hundreds of aircraft were gone. And the pilots Japan had spent years training were disappearing faster than they could ever be replaced. By the evening of the 19th of June, the battle was already decided. Japan had lost hundreds of aircraft. The American fleet had suffered almost no meaningful damage. But the victory created another question, one that divided American commanders. Should they chase? Admiral Mark Mitcher and many of his aviators wanted to continue west immediately. They knew the Japanese carriers were damaged. They knew their air groups were devastated. This was the opportunity to destroy what remained of Japan's carrier force. But Admiral Raymond Spruance made a different decision. He refused to abandon his primary mission. His job was not simply to destroy Japanese ships. His job was to protect the invasion of Saipan. Spruance understood something that others did not. A fleet could win a battle and still lose a war if it failed its mission. He feared the Japanese might be attempting another deception. If he chased the carriers too aggressively, he could leave thousands of American troops vulnerable. So he stayed, he accepted criticism. He accepted the possibility that history might judge him as too cautious. But he made the decision he believed was necessary. Because command was not about choosing the most dramatic action. It was about choosing the responsibility you could not abandon. The next day brought another impossible decision. The Japanese fleet was retreating. American scouts finally located it late in the afternoon. But the distance was enormous. The target was hundreds of miles away. A strike would push American aircraft to the absolute edge of their range. Many pilots would not have enough fuel to return safely. Mitcher knew the risk. Every commander who sent those aircraft into the sky understood what he was asking. Some men would not come home. But if they did nothing, the Japanese fleet would escape. The order was given. More than 200 American aircraft launched. They flew west into the setting sun. The attack succeeded. Japanese ships were damaged. The carrier Haifei was sunk. But now came the hardest part. The Americans had to return. Night had fallen. The ocean was endless. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Pilots searched the darkness for the fleet. Many knew they might never find it. Then Mitcher made one of the most famous decisions of his career. He ordered the fleet to turn on its lights. Carrier decks illuminated. Searchlights pointed into the sky. Ships that normally hid from enemy submarines became visible targets. The entire American fleet announced its position to the enemy, all to save its pilots. Aircraft appeared out of the darkness. Some landed on the wrong carriers. Some crashed. Some fell into the ocean. Destroyers raced through the water, searching for survivors. But because the fleet was visible, hundreds of men found their way home. The decision was dangerous. It was also deeply human. Mitcher had asked his pilots to risk everything. When they needed him, he risked everything for them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not decided by one attack. It was decided by years of preparation, by choices made long before the first aircraft launched. Japan had created a brilliant plan, but it was a plan designed for the Navy Japan had in 1942, not the Navy it possessed in 1944. Ozawa had range, he had surprise, he had capable ships, but he did not have enough experienced pilots. And that was the resource that mattered most. Aircraft could be built, ships could be replaced. Pilots required years, and Japan had spent those years losing them. The battle destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. Months later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan still had carriers, but many carried almost no aircraft. They became decoys. Their purpose was no longer to launch attacks. Their purpose was simply to be seen and sacrificed. The man who commanded that final carrier force was Jisaburo Ozawa, the same commander who had once sailed into the Philippine Sea believing he could save the empire. Now he commanded ships without an air force. The transformation was complete. The battle he had hoped would restore Japan's power had revealed that the power was already gone. The Americans continued toward Japan. Saipan fell. Guam fell. Tinian fell. From those islands, B-29 bombers eventually reached the Japanese homeland. The nightmare Japan feared became reality. The war had arrived at its doorstep. And it happened because of the battle where Japan spent the last generation of its elite pilots. There is one final image that remains. Not the explosions, not the sinking carriers, not the victory celebrations. It is the image of young Japanese pilots climbing into aircraft that had almost no chance of surviving. Many of them never returned. They were sent into the sky carrying the hopes of a nation that had already run out of time. Far below them, the Philippine Sea kept no record of their names. But beneath those waves lies the truth of the battle. Wars are not won only by the strongest weapons. They are won by the decisions made before the fighting begins. And in June 1944, one side had spent years building the future. The other was sending its past into the sky.